In this section, we want to talk about the content of the worksheet. In the row below our existing data, we want to put in formulas that show you how you can do cumulative totals and also how to do percentages of increase. None of these are really difficult, but sometimes if you attempt to look these up in books, you won't find them. As you recall earlier, we typed in the heading YTD, meaning year-to-date profits, in cell A5. And before we proceed with the actual formula, you'll notice that that piece of information does take up a wider space than column A has width. So you might want to consider how we would deal with that. And also, by the way, if we make this bold, watch how the entry becomes even wider. A simple adjustment here, and there are two ways to do this, is simply to point to the boundary between column A and B, between the two letters, and click and drag to a desired width. But even better, perhaps, even easier, and I'll just undo this to show you the other technique. Imagine that we hadn't done what we just did. A simpler way is to use the so-called best fit feature, and if you simply double-click between the boundaries of the letters A and B, double-click, column A becomes as wide as it needs to be. That's called a best fit. Now you can, at different times, make a column wider or narrower, however wide you wish to make it, but the double clicking is faster and it does make the column as wide as the widest entry happens to be. Let's move on with the formulas now. As I had said, there's no way to really look up in a book on Excel, year-to-date or cumulative total. You're unlikely to find it anywhere. You might happen to see it in an example, but it's usually not an indexed item. Let's ask ourselves the question, how much profit has existed or does exist at the end of January here? Well, we can see the number. It happens to be 20, but we don't want to type in 20. We want to make sure that this cell contains the same information as the cell above it. So the straightforward formula in this case is simply equal, and we can either type the B4 or click in it and hit enter, and we'll see the information there. Now, another thing that I might do here, and this is not critical, but just to shift our focus away from the colors here, I'm going to take off these screen colors. And one way to do this is to simply highlight these cells. And then remember how we created them off this bucket here. We can click the down arrow and choose no fill. And there's a standard background. Now we still have the lines in place. That's okay. All right, let's return to our formulas. In C5, we need a formula here that's going to calculate our year-to-date profit. And at a glance, you might say, well, let's simply add this cell to this cell. Well, if we did that, we'd get the answer 50, and that would be correct. But sometimes you have to pause and think about what's going to be happening in the cell to the right. If we do a cumulative total here, what should it be? If we do the same relative thing, in other words, if we add the current month to the previous month, we get the answer of 60 here, and that's really not correct. So sometimes you have to think about it a little bit. The formula that will work here, that's going to work in the same relative way in these cells, would be a formula that adds the current month, in this case February, and the previous total. It's this kind of we want a relationship between these two cells. So our formula here is going to be equal sign, and I'm going to use the technique of clicking with the mouse, C4 plus B5, hit enter. And remember how previously we had copied formulas across. If we copy this formula into this cell and this cell, moving rightward, all the way out into G5, in each case we will be adding the cell above where this formula is going to go and the cell to the left of it. So with no further thought, let's click and drag this fill handle into G5. And the result in each case here is a formula that adds the cell, in this case D4 plus C5, 30 plus 50 is 80. And in this case here, E4 plus D5. 40 plus 80, 120. And we see the resulting cumulative or year-to-date total in each case here. And again, this is not that difficult, although when you first write your formula in C5, it might look just fine to say, well, I'll just add these two cells. Well, it works for that particular month only. If you think about it, if you do add those cells, what you're saying is a cumulative total, a year-to-date total, is simply the current month plus the previous month. And that, of course, is inaccurate. We want to say our total is the current month plus the previous year-to-date. And so we have more information here. Now, we're on our way to creating more and more information out of these 12 original cells. And we can do more here. Now, this isn't necessarily a goal, but the idea would be if these are numbers that you are familiar with, you want to gain greater insight into what they mean. First of all, calculating profits, then year-to-date profits, keeping track of the totals and averages. And another characteristic of this that you might want to track would be the percentage of increase from month to month in your profit. And let's hope your company grows, your little operation grows, as it appears to be doing here, except between February and March, where it remains constant. So in A6, let's put in another heading, percent profit growth, and you can use the percent symbol above the number 5 key, percent profit growth. And we might, to be consistent, make that bold. And once again, we may need to make the column wider. And if we simply double-click on the right-hand side of this column, up where the letters are, the column is now wide enough. Now, earlier I had mentioned that the zoom bar up here can be useful for seeing all of our data, more of our data, less of our data, depending upon the circumstances. We're missing the appearance right now of column I. We can just see a glimpse of it. So here's what we might do. Sometimes you want to zoom back perhaps to 75%. We can certainly see everything now. But there's also an additional aspect of the zoom control box that I think you want to know about. Suppose you're saying to yourself, I'd like to see all of this information on my screen. I'd like to see it as large as it can be without any of it getting clipped off. We have made a selection here of the data we want to see. And if you point into the zoom control box, click on the down arrow, and move to selection, you'll see that the information is now all visible. However, take a look at cell H2. And what's the problem here? We haven't seen this before, and don't panic. It simply means that this cell is not wide enough to display the result. And if we drag it slightly to the right, now we can see it, and we can see all of our other information. Now, we didn't actively choose 94%, but by choosing selection and using zoom control, that's the kind of shrinkage or adjustment percentage that's needed to show all of our work here. All right, let's take a look at percent profit growth. What we would like to show here is the percentage of change from month to month for our profit figures. We moved from 20 to 30 to 30 to 40 to 60 to 65. So we'd like to put in a formula here. There's no entry for January since we don't have our December number to compare it with. In C6, we need a formula that figures out the percent of growth from 20 to 30. Remember, if you grow from 20 to 30, you've grown by 10. 10 is what percentage of what you started with? It may have been a while since you've done this sort of thing, but in different ways, we see this frequently in newspapers when we read about business change. It's not uncommon to see the figure percent profit growth or profit change. The formula, there are a couple of ways to do this. And again, I emphasize trying to look this up in a book on Excel, it may be difficult to find something like this. Equal sign. We first need to calculate the change here. I'm going to use parentheses, and then when we finish this, I'll explain why. We want to subtract whatever is in C4, subtract from that B4. C4 minus B4. And once we get that result, we want to divide it, that's the slash key, by B4. And that's the way the formula is looking. We take the difference, we divide by B4. And the answer is 0.5. And usually we're used to seeing this as a percent. So in our toolbar, in the formatting toolbar, percent style. Click here. That's the answer. Now, what we want to do, though, is consider why we use parentheses, and did we need to use parentheses? And the answer, of course, is yes. In Excel, when you write a formula, as we did here, if you don't use parentheses, information is evaluated, formulas are evaluated, on the basis of what's called a hierarchy. And I'm just going to write down the symbols here in different cells. In